Hey, class, welcome back to Psychology of Adjustment. We are moving from chapter 9, looking at the formation of relationships, platonic, romantic, etc. And now we are going to switch gears and look at a more specific type of relationship, marriage and intimate relationships, or specific types of relationships, I should say. So, looking at marriage, kind of that, for some, thinking about romantic relationships, marriage is what a lot of people mean when they say, oh, I wonder if this, relationship can go all the way, for example, can it lead to marriage, forming a, very personal, intimate bond relationship. So first thing we're going to be looking at is initially sort of challenging the traditional model of marriage, because this concept of marriage has undergone a lot of changes. And even, within the last 10 years, I mean, if you want to think about the case, I believe the case that decided the Supreme Court case, I believe it's Oberfell. I may be mispronouncing that. Did that allowed for same-sex marriage to come to be legalized, happened in 2015. I'm recording this video in 2022. That's only 7 years ago, which, seems like a long time ago. And for some people, younger people might think, oh, gay marriage, it's been a thing forever, but it really hasn't. Our understanding of marriage has evolved quite a bit, and still continues to change and evolve. So at the end of this section, you will be able to discuss 6 social trends that are affecting the institution of marriage, define marriage, and discuss the current status of same-sex marriage. So marriage, sort of as defined by the textbook, is the legally and socially sanctioned union of sexually intimate adults. And this is typically conducted via a wedding, which is the merging of two metals, to become one. No, I'm just kidding. That's a joke from The Office. If you've ever seen, I think it's like season 2 of The Office. But traditionally speaking, marriage incorporates economic interdependence, husband and wife, the household income sort of coming together, common residence living together, sexual fidelity, meaning you are monogamously committed to one another, and then shared responsibility for things like rearing children. And those things are still part of marriage. I mean, but they are, the definition and expansion of marriage is certainly redefine some of those things. So that sort of traditional model of marriage is being challenged, and there are certain trends we can identify that show that kind of traditional model of marriage is outdated. For one, we see increased acceptance of singlehood, like people remaining single. It is becoming far more socially acceptable for people to postpone marriage for longer periods of time, or just flat out not get married. Number two, there is a much more increased social acceptance of cohabitation, meaning people living together before they are married. I mean, there's probably, if we think about like generations, like, if I think about my grandparents, like that would be absolutely unheard of, would be very much frowned upon. But then maybe my dad's generation, my mom's generation, for example, it's probably still frowned upon, but much less so. And now, my generation, it's, almost expected, if you, before you marry someone, it's almost uncommon if you don't spend time with them, live with them, prior to getting married. We can also see trends in terms of the age at which people are choosing to get married. This data only goes to 2010, so there are some limitations to this, but the trend typically, it's a fairly linear trend. We see both males and females are postponing marriage later in life. Some other trends, reduce premium on permanence, like this idea, people are just becoming more comfortable with the idea of impermanence, that, relationships, life, it changes, it evolves. One of those changes is transitions in things like gender roles. The expectations about what men and women are expected to do within a relationship are becoming much more varied, more flexible, more ambiguous. More women are now in the workforce than ever before. More men are, more willing to stay at home, share the workload, things like that, homework, things like that. We also see a trend in increased voluntary childlessness. So there are people who are not only postponing marriage, putting off marriage, or foregoing it altogether. There are also people who, even if they are married or unmarried, are choosing not to rear children. And then also we really see just the decline of what is considered the nuclear family. There was this sort of traditional view of a family, meaning, mom, dad, typically two children home. Maybe it's a boy and a girl, or two boys, two girls, whatever. White picket fence, all of that sort of American dream ethos that still rings true to some people. But that idea of a family has declined. Like, we see there are a lot more single parent households. There are a lot more households that are being where children are being raised by their grandparents. There are a lot more households where you have families who, let's say, they are two, a husband and wife who are choosing not to have kids, and they're the closest thing to have to kids is their dog. I mean, things like that. So the definition and conceptual understanding of marriage is continuing to evolve. And we can see again this trend towards more and more women entering the labor force. It's at an all-time high. I think there are some numbers that showed that COVID might have affected those numbers negatively, but as we see the workforce kind of getting back to things post-COVID, or not only post-COVID, but post-lockdown, I should say, those trends are likely continuing to rise. Okay, so let's switch gears and look at why people decide to get married. So by the end of this section, you will be able to describe some cultural influences on marriage, identify several factors influencing the selection of a mate, somebody you want to marry and potentially have children with, summarize research on predictors of marital success. So there are many different cultural influences on marriage. So for example, I mean, the cultural pressure of getting married is mostly, it's continuing to decline for, let's say, American society. Maybe 100 years ago, if you were 18, there is a lot of pressure to start a family, start your life, kind of separate from your family. Nowadays, if you're 18, that might be the furthest thing from your mind. So as culture changes, time changes, that has a pretty profound influence on whether people decide to get married. And we even see less instances of like arranged marriages. They still happen, but really the change, the biggest influence is how much romantic love seems to be the center of marriage in terms of all cultural experiences. It's not just getting married to have someone provide for you, or getting married to create children. I mean, those things are important too, but love seems to be the centerpiece. There are still cultural, differences in terms of how much romantic love is the prerequisite. Most cultures, around the world, 80% practice arranged marriages. So, it's important, but it's not the end all be all. Priority is also placed on families rather than the individual's welfare when we think about those cultures where maybe arranged marriage. So arranged marriage still exists, but we are seeing that maybe the role of romantic love becomes more and more important as those relationships, deepen and evolve. So some important terms when we think about selecting a mate, one of those is monogamy, and this is having only one mate at a time, one spouse at a time. Being a serial monogamous means you're in a relationship with this person, and maybe that ends and you get into a relationship with another person, but when you're in a relationship, that is who you are with. It's not as common, but there still are some cultures that influence polygamy. We're having more than one spouse. I mean, sort of as a stereotype, you often hear associated with Mormon culture, but it's not the only culture. And I think even for example, like the LDS, the church, that the primary church for the Mormon faith, really is trying to distance itself from that image. So, but it's a practice. In many cultures, it's more common, it's much more common to see men having multiple wives than the opposite. And then the women in those relationships tend to have less access to money, education, independence, political power, etc. Some other important terms: endogamy. This is the tendency of people to marry people within your own social group. It's kind of, it's the same thing. We're attracted to people who are like us, who are similar to us. Homogamy, the tendency for people to marry others who have similar personal characteristics. So it's, whether that might be, this person, looks like me, they're the same race, same ethnicity, we're the same height, we like the same things, we have the same personality traits, whatever, but there's a tendency for, we're more likely to marry people who are like us and who belong to the same social group, whether that's social class or whatever. So gender and mate preferences are also important to consider because, it's not the same. It's not going to be the reasoning behind why males select or, men select their mate versus, women are going to vary. So women are much more likely to place importance on socioeconomic status, intelligence, ambition, financial prospects, whereas men are more likely to place value on physical attractiveness, youthfulness. I mean, some of this we talked about in chapter 9, but there are different expectations, and these are much more sort of socially primed rather than just being caused by being a male or by being a female. What are some predictors looking at research that explores marital success? There's a lot of research in psychology that looks at, why marriages both succeed and fail. And research points to a number of areas. One, family background. If your parents are divorced, if you come from a home where your parents are divorced, you are much more likely statistically to divorce yourself. Age, people who are younger, if you marry younger, are more likely to divorce. The length of the courtship prior to marriage, so longer periods. If you're dating someone for a longer period of time, that's more associated with marital success. Certain personality traits, characteristics, being someone who scores high in perfectionism, insecurity, those are associated with marital problems. The premarital interaction, how well did you get along? What were your communication patterns, things like that. I mean, what were those like prior to marriage? Those are really good predictors of what those things will be like during marriage. Okay, adjustment, looking at marital adjustment across the life cycle. So we're going to, by the end of the section, you'll be able to describe the family life cycle, identify factors couple weigh in deciding whether or not to have children, analyze the dynamics of the transition to parenthood, identify common problems that surface as a family's children reach adolescence, and discuss the transitions that occur in the later cycles or the later stages of the family life cycle. So this even our definition of a family evolves and adapts as the family grows and changes, and it's sort of dynamic. So we've looked at individual life cycles in terms of looking at lifespan and different theories there, but also we can think about how the family changes. And so the family life cycle is defined as an orderly sequence of developmental stages that families tend to progress through, that assuming the family stays intact, there are no major disruptions. These are kind of the trajectory we might see. And a lot of this comes from Carter and McGoldrick's work, their model, and looking at the specific challenges that families will face as they progress through the life cycle together. So you'll have that different aspects might affect between families. Some effects might, so looking at unattached young adults, people postpone their marriage. This will kind of lengthen certain stages. And also we can look at, the joining together, what happens when, couples form, when that family comes together from marriage, looking at specifically the stage of like the honeymoon stage where satisfaction is probably maybe its highest. So yeah, so we have a couple of different, we have 6 different, here's the different stages, the 6, we have between families, the unattached young adult. During this time, maybe you're looking for acceptance, you're looking for kind of breaking into your own kind of separation, differentiating the self, really starting to separate yourself and maybe even establishing yourself as an individual in terms of work and career. Stage 2, the joining of families through marriage. This is where you're bringing 2 families together, you're committing to a new family system. This is the formation of the actual marriage system. Number 3, the family with young children. Not only are you a couple, but now you're a couple who's brought another individual into the world, which means you're accepting new members into this system, the children, whether they are, biologically born, adopted, whatever, you're adding to the family dynamics. And changing new parent, taking on those parenting roles. And that's going to change, as children age, your role as a parent and your role within the family will evolve. It's going to change a lot. For example, when children become adolescents, in terms of allowing children to explore, become more independent, that's going to be a primary role in terms of being an agent of socialization. Stage 5, this is allowing those children, you've reared them successfully, hopefully enough that they can start moving on and maybe creating lives of their own, families of their own, maybe careers, things like that. And then thinking about the family later in life, maybe once the children have left the home. And this is really starting to look at different roles, different generational roles, sort of looking at, okay, what can I do to help the next generation? What role do I fit in of helping and assisting the next generation? Okay, so kind of looking at those stages again, I think that one slide should have been moved ahead or maybe towards the end, but different expectations, family with young children, the major transition is like that first birth is really big. It's really important. And afterwards, each child, if families decide to have more than one kid, the stress typically goes down because you've been there, you've done that. You have much more realistic expectations of what should happen. With adolescence, when those children grow up and they evolve, this might be one of the more difficult stages in terms of marital satisfaction. There's a lot more conflict typically. Maybe it's somewhat overstated in pop culture, but conflict is likely to arise. And this is also a time at which you might see a sandwich generation, meaning you have parents who are raising children at home, but are also helping take care of their own aging parents. Maybe their parents are still living independently, or maybe they're living in an assisted facility, or maybe they're even moving in with their children. But one way or another, they're kind of taking care of multiple generations. Stage 5, again, launching children into that next, into the adult world for themselves. This is where you might see the development of the empty nest phase, where basically parents have to transition to, now we don't have to parent 24/7 like we used to. What do we do? What do we do with all that time? So being able to kind of find yourself outside of your role in parenthood is really, it's an important predictor of marital satisfaction. And then some problems can arise when children, if they return home, for whatever reason, maybe career, work, all kinds of things, might choose to come home, which can result in kind of returning to some of that conflict. In terms of family later in life, once children are out of the home, this is where you start to see marital satisfaction reach, one of its high points. When you have more time, you're not concerned about, dedicating so much time towards raising children. So satisfaction can increase because you have more time to spend on each other. But then you also have to worry about things like declining health, or perhaps even losing a spouse. So those are kind of new dynamics that enter the concern. Okay, now we're going to look at vulnerable areas and adjusting to marriage. So at the end of this section, you'll be able to discuss how role expectations, work, and financial issues may affect marital adjustment for better or worse. You'll be able to summarize evidence on the relationship between communication quality and marital adjustment. So there are not surprising at all, but when you agree to enter into a marriage, forming a family, both sides have certain expectations, maybe expectations of themselves, expectations for each other. And, even the best of couples are going to there might be gaps in those expectations, and new expectations, again, as the dynamics of marriage change, so are the expectations of what is expected as certain marital roles. And for women especially, those are being greatly affected. Now we see more women are demanding careers. It's not the sole importance of having children, raising children, being in a family. Those things are great, but now we're seeing a much more focus on career minded. However, even though there's a big focus on careers, remember, in a marriage, only the female participant, and well, I guess, if we're talking about heterosexual couples, of course, if we have male female dynamic, only one of those two can have children, the other one can't. Obviously that's different if we're talking about a different type of dynamic, of course. But if a family decides to have children, that interrupts the careers for the mother. It's less likely to interrupt the career for their for the husband. Even though we do see the changing dynamics of relationships and marriage, we do still see a majority of work in terms of housework is being performed by females. 65% is what the most recent data, at least from this textbook, is concerned, is able to find. So the gap is changing, but there still definitely is a gap. So again, this idea of work and career issues, it's an adjustment. Both husbands and wives are going to likely to struggle kind of balancing those dynamics of work and family. However, there are benefits of having those multiple roles, being involved and having multiple social roles. One, it gives you more areas of social support. You have more people to lean on. You have an increased income. Having two incomes is going to improve things like socioeconomic status more than one. And then you have more in common. Being individuals, being career minded, being work minded is something else you can connect and relate to. Work can also influence, children's development. I mean, if you have both parents are in the workforce, then you have, that theoretically means you have less time. Both parents have less time to spend with their children. But parents have to kind of balance that, that work, career, parenthood balance, and so you having dual careers in a family, that's another thing that parents have to think about, like what impact that might have on their children. Are they going to go to daycare? Are they going to get a nanny? I mean, or how soon are we going to put them into school? Are they going to go to pre-K? But and some even would take this as a reason why you should only have one breadwinner in the home. But really, there's no evidence that suggests that women being in the workforce has any harm on children, especially after they're the age of one. At that point, it's totally fine to have more than one, for children to go to daycare or something like that. There's other avenues than just having one or both parents at home. Financial also things that are concerned. I mean, especially if you're talking about, having children, obviously that adds a whole nother, mouth you have to feed, person to take care of, and that adds to the responsibility. But the more, what for whatever reason, wherever the financial worries and troubles come from, these are associated with things like increased hostility in husbands, increased depression in wives, lower satisfaction, lower marital happiness for both spouses. And this can be compounded with debt. Like if you have couples who are in debt, the more consumer debt individuals have, you tend to see more couples are more likely to argue about things like money, especially like, hey, who is going to pay off debt? Happy couples who are, well adjusted, are more likely to make joint decisions in terms of their finances. They're going to more likely to be financially competent and communicate that together. Communication is also a really important area. It's a vulnerable area where kind of giver, depending on which way you go, can strongly influence the degree of success in a marriage. There are certain patterns identified that are risk factors for divorce in terms of communication. A lot of this comes from the research by Gottman, the Gottman Institute, Gottman is like the premier researcher on marriage. So when you hear communication patterns that involve things like contempt, criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, belligerence, those are like big red flags that, the couple, it's not saying, oh, these are going to cause the couple to get divorced, but they're red flags that there's a good predictor there. Okay, what happens when a marriage dissolves? Divorce is it does affect a lot of marriages. So after this section, you'll be able to describe the evidence on changing divorce rates and on factors that go into deciding divorce. Analyze how spouses and children tend to adjust after divorce. Summarize the data on remarriage and the impact on step families on children, because sometimes people remarry, they get a divorce and get remarried, and they form those two families come together and make a new family. The research shows about half of marriages in the United States will end in divorce, but individuals typically underestimate their own likelihood. They might think, oh, it happens to this couple, it happens to this other couple, but it's not going to happen to us. Most divorces typically are going to happen within the first decade of marriage, and they're usually tied to things like communication difficulties, like we talked about in the previous slide, infidelity, jealousy, growing apart for whatever reason, bad, money behavior, maybe spending money recklessly, substance abuse, things like that are but here's kind of, that first 5 years or so, that first 10 years, the likelihood of getting divorced is pretty high, but after that, it just plummets. People do get divorced, late into their marriages, but it becomes less and less frequent the longer you stay together. But if couples do decide to get divorced, it's not a simple decision. It is a complex decision it's usually not one single event that, we got into this argument and therefore I'm going to divorce you. It's usually The marriage is sort of, this is not the best way to put it, but it's death by 1,000 cuts. Maybe it's all of these little arguments over the last X number of years that finally add up, and maybe that's kind of what the straw that breaks the camel's back, or however you want to put it. Regardless of who initiates this, it is stressful for both individuals, for all parties involved. Tends to have a more negative impact on men's physical health and their mortality, but for women, it tends to be more disruptive for women socially, economically, psychologically, especially if there are children involved. So it is an adjustment. It is quite the adjustment to going from a married family, home life, to one that is divorced. There might be, it's you're less likely to adjust well if you're preoccupied with what your ex-spouse is doing, like, oh, are they associate, or are they seeing other people yet, things like that. Factors that are associated with favorable adjustment, however, are one, money. Money helps a lot. Having a higher income helps. It makes that transition easier, makes that landing much softer. Getting remarried, starting another family. Having a more positive attitude about divorce, understanding that it sucks, but hey, this is a chance to change. It's a chance to grow. It's a chance to be a better person. Being the partner who initiated the divorce. If you're the one who initiated it, you're more likely to adjust versus the person maybe who didn't initiate it. That also have to take into consideration when individuals get divorced, it doesn't just affect the couple that's getting divorced, it also affects if they have children, and depending on the effect it has on those children it's very complex. In some cases it overall can have a negative impact, but there are some cases where divorce can actually have a positive impact, especially if it's reducing conflict, it's removing conflict that was once present. It's kind of like an example of negative reinforcement. If a child was initially exposed to lots of arguing, lots of fighting, tension, things like that in the household, then divorce ends that, then there you go. That actually can be a positive thing, but obviously, it's still not a good thing overall. But in some cases, there are silver linings to be found. Some instances after divorce, people decide to remarry. Actually, the majority of divorced people eventually remarry. They get married again. However, previous divorce is a good predictor of future divorce, because individuals who have divorced and remarried are slightly higher of getting divorced a second time. We are seeing, again, this idea of a changing dynamic of family is we see more step families, more blended families. We have, spouses and children from two different marriages are coming together, and it's becoming much more common. And of course, that presents another set of kind of unique adjustment challenges. So, if a family, we looked previously at 6 stages of family development. The same thing is happening with step families. Stage 1, this fantasy stage, it's very idealistic, very unrealistic. An example might be, oh, I love my new wife and I'll certainly love her children. And that's a great thing to aspire to. Stage 2 is immersion, real life challenges and expectations of bringing these two families together. Stage 3, it's awareness. Families are trying to make sense out of those new arrangements. Mobilization, family members attempt to negotiate difficulty. So, for example, eating together as a family is important enough that I'm willing to speak with my husband about it. I want us to come together and eat together. Stage 5 is action, creating strategic strategies to resolve potential differences. So maybe having weekly meetings to kind of air out. Stage 6 is contact, and this is where positive emotional bonds. This is where you're starting to see each other as a family unit, meshing together. Stage 7, resolution. Norms are established, and the family has their own kind of new rituals. So this is where you see the new family kind of takes on its own identity. Okay, so mostly what we've looked at so far has been looking at heterosexual couples, but again, same-sex marriage is a pretty new phenomenon in terms of its, the legality of it. It's 2015 that it became legal, so much about what we know about same-sex marriage is fairly recent new information. So we'll look at, by the end of this section, you'll be able to discuss a unique challenge to same-sex couples, compare homosexual and heterosexual couples in regard to their relationship stability and adjustment, describe the dynamics of same-sex families and the adjustment of children with same-sex parents. So we'll start with kind of looking at some table setting terms. Same-sex couples, we're typically referring to couples, where the couples are individuals in the couple are gay. So you have homosexual men and then we have women who considered lesbian. Most homosexual women typically prefer to be referred to as lesbian. That's why sometimes you'll hear it referred to as gay and lesbian couples. Sometimes I guess you can say gay couple and it's a blanket term, but the preference, the more we understand about LGBTQ plus the community, I think it's important to make sure we honor those preferences. So about 40 to 60% of gay males and 45 to 80% of lesbian females are in committed relationships. I think there's kind of an outdated stereotype that monogamy is less common in same-sex relationships, but the data actually proves otherwise. So if we start to compare heterosexual couples and homosexual couples, same-sex couples do exist in a different social context and are subject to more prejudice and discrimination. It makes sense because it hasn't even been 10 years that same-sex couples were allowed to get married. It's the DSM-3 was not that long ago, I believe in the 1980s, that labeled homosexuality as a mental illness. So, it's only fairly recently that we've even come to accept that, same-sex couples are even allowed to marry. But in terms of similarities, same-sex relationships do have similar levels of love and commitment, similar levels of overall satisfaction, sexual satisfaction, same kinds of relationship goals, similar predictors of success, similar sources of conflict, meaning they might fight, over the same kinds of issues, money being one of them, and similar patterns to how those conflicts are resolved. In terms of parenting, gay and lesbian people are typically, thought of as more of as individuals than as members of families. Again, that's kind of if we've for most of American history, we haven't even allowed these people to get married, and it's only recently it's we've thought about them for so long as individuals. It's only recently we're like, oh yeah, if you're married, you're a family, okay. But we're actually seeing same-sex parents are very involved with their parents, with their children. There's no evidence to suggest that they're less. And the same thing for adjustment. Children who come from same-sex households are just as overall well adjusted as children who come from heterosexual parents. What about couples who choose not to get married? What about individuals who decide to cohabitate, maybe living together in an intimate relationship, a sexual relationship, but one that is not defined by marriage? We're seeing a lot more couples deciding to cohabitate. It's much more common. And it's like a trial marriage. It's a way to kind of figure out, hey, how do we get along, when we live together? But interestingly enough, it's actually, the research suggests that it's associated with increases in discord, marital discord, and not success. So it doesn't necessarily mean, I think if you live together and you fight, it's probably a good predictor that you're going to fight during marriage, which makes sense. Past behavior is a pretty good predictor of future behavior. So the cohabiting, in terms of couples going up. I'm sure the pandemic, maybe, I don't know what influence that has had on it, but maybe more people deciding to live together. What about people who decide to remain single, maybe decide they don't want to get married? Now we're seeing more and more people, we're seeing why the single population is growing. People are taking longer to get married, and also rising rates of divorce, about 1 in 2. So maybe some people see that and they say, yeah, I'm good for now, I'll wait. It used to be a lot of stereotypes associated with people who were single, they're bitter, unhappy, or they're swingers, but there's really not a lot of support for either of those claims, really. And compared to people who are married, singles do tend to exhibit worse health patterns, physical health, and typically rate themselves as less happy. However, those differences are mostly modest. If we look at those normal distributions, there's probably way more overlap than not. And this tends to apply more to men more so than women, per the data. Okay, so let's take some of our understanding about marriage and relationships and apply it to understanding intimate partner violence or domestic violence. By the end of this section, you will be able to discuss the incident of partner abuse and the characteristics of batterers and explain why women stay in abusive relationships, discuss the incidence and consequence of date rape, as well as the factors that contribute to it, and understand ways to reduce the likelihood of date rape. So what is intimate partner violence? I think previously some people refer to it as domestic violence. This is aggression towards somebody who is in a close relationship. This is, maybe it's a girlfriend, boyfriend, partner, and it doesn't necessarily have to be physical abuse. It can be psychological abuse. It can be sexual abuse, obviously. And the more common patterns or, that we see and understand are partner abuse and date rape. So partner abuse can come, a number of ways. It can literally be physically, punching, pushing, kicking, choking, anything like that. Emotional abuse might be withholding money, controlling somebody, humiliating them publicly or privately. Sexual abuse, obviously, it can happen in a number of ways. Using sex to manipulate somebody, to control somebody, to demean them, to physically coerce somebody into sex. things like that would all fall into that category. So what about the incidence, the prevalence? Men and women are victimized. However, so that's important. One, it doesn't just happen to women, but it's more likely to happen to women. Women are victims in 85% of non-fatal crimes and are victims in 75% of murders that are committed by spouses. Victims typically suffer from alcohol or anxiety, depression, substance abuse, feeling helpless, post-traumatic stress disorder. So a huge impact on mental health. Children, if there are children present and they witness any kind of abuse, physical violence, they're also at risk for anxiety, depression, substance abuse, PTSD, all of those things just mentioned. What about the people engaging in the abuse? Typically there are certain risk factors associated with domestic violence: being unemployed, engaging in substance and alcohol abuse, getting angered easily, attitudes, being kind of, open to aggression, very high stress, being exposed to violence as a child as well. That's a huge predictor. That's a pretty big red flag there too. Why do people stay in abusive relationships? You might think intuitively, oh my gosh, if they're abusing you, you got to get away, but it's not that simple. It's not that easy. One, there are certain economic hardship. If you decide to separate, your income might get cut in half or more, nowhere else to go, feeling guilt or shame, maybe not wanting to admit to family and friends that, hey, I'm in this abusive relationship. They also might fear that it's worse. If I leave this person, they might, the abuse might become more severe. And there are actually some statistics that support that fear that, if I leave this person, they might literally kill me, especially if it involves maybe like removing the child from the home. Another example of partner violence is date rape. This is forcing and unwanting intercourse during the context of dating. It could be putting something in somebody's drink, or it could be like coercing somebody, to have sex with you even when they don't want to. It can happen on first dates. It can happen after many dates. It can happen between engaged couples. It's not just the person at a party who slipped something in somebody's drink. That does happen, but it happens in other forms too. This could be also verbal or physical coercion. It can involve a weapon. And the consequences of this, this typically happens by someone, like if someone is, somebody who's raped, it's typically by someone they know. It's typically someone they trust. And when that happens, it can be particularly traumatic because you have that broken trust. And there are a lot of mental health, physical and mental health consequences: depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, substance abuse, increased risk of suicide. So it is a very real deal. Other contributing factors: alcohol and drugs, especially those, drugs that are considered date rape drugs, different gender differences in sexual standards, miscommunication about, whether there is consent or not that's taken place. And you're starting to see much more, campaigns on campuses and universities, for example, are being more explicit in talking about these things, like what is consent and what does it mean to, to get consent before sex is to take place. Other contributing factors: men are more likely to be the offenders if they're impulsive, low in empathy, more hostile towards women, engaging in heavy alcohol use, endorse traditional stereotypes, had more consensual sex partners than their peers and have poor anger management skills. Like each one of these is by itself, is but the more boxes we check, it's like these are more, kind of red flags we might associate with this specific behavior. Other situational factors can increase the likelihood of date rape. It's more likely to happen if the man actually knows the woman. They're more of an isolated setting. If they've had more consensual sexual activity, and maybe the man is misperceiving. Maybe they laughed at my joke, and I thought they were interested in me, and in the past, but turns out they weren't. So what can be done to protect oneself from this, especially if you are a female student watching this lecture? Be aware that excessive alcohol, drug use do undermine self-control in terms of sexual interactions on both sides. Don't leave drinks unattended when dating someone new. Maybe those initial encounters should be public rather than private. Watch out for your friends. Be mindful of your friends, especially if you're at parties, especially if you're around people and they're consuming alcohol and drugs and things like that. And be explicit, be open, communicate feelings about expectations in terms of sex and things like that. This isn't going to stop everything from happening, but I think the more awareness we have about these things, can prevent so much of this from happening. So anyways, that's going to do it for chapter 10. Let me know if you have any questions. Drop them in the comment section, or just leave them to me via email or on Canvas. So otherwise, I'll see you around for chapter 11. Take care. Bye.